And a fun night of science is on the way. So kick back, relax, while we learn what's new in science today. At the Science Cafe, at the Science Cafe, at the Science Cafe.
Hello everyone, my name is Laura and I'm going to be the MC tonight. So we're really glad that you came and found us here on our new day, Tuesdays, and in our new location at Amherst Brewing Company. So thank you for sticking with us, and I'm sure we'll see you again in March and April and also in May for our other great programs this semester. So just a couple things before we get to the science. You may have seen the servers around. I think we have 3 of them tonight. So if you'd like food or drinks, if you'd like to order something, flag one of them down. I think there are drink menus maybe on some of the tables already, but there are food menus that can be delivered to you, and you can order whatever you'd like. Let's see, what else? So the way the evening is going to work is I'm going to talk with our guest, Sarah Goodwin, and we're going to break the evening down into 3 sections. So I will ask Sarah some questions, and then we will open the floor to you, the audience, and you will have a chance to ask questions about the topics we've just been discussing. And then Sarah and I will chat again, we'll open it back up, and then we'll do that again one last time. So that's the general plan. We're going to be talking about a lot of different related things tonight. So Sarah is a PhD candidate in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass, and she studies sexual selection and communication. She works with songbirds, and we're going to start off. The title of the program tonight, as you probably know, is Neighborhood Watch, Social Eavesdropping in Birds. So we're going to start the evening off talking a bit about neighborhoods and neighbors. We're going to start by talking about humans, and then we'll move into animal neighbors, and then a little later on we're going to talk about birdsong and how you study birdsong, and then we'll get to some really interesting work that Sarah has published recently, and talk about some of her results. Okay, well, hi Sarah.
Hi Laura. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay, so could you just start off by talking a bit about what makes a neighborhood?
Sure, a neighborhood. So probably this concept is most familiar to humans. So unless you live in, I don't know, Leverett, you might have neighbors pretty nearby you. So you have your own little piece of the world, be it rented or owned. And your neighbors are members of the same species that live nearby, that have their own little slice of the world. And you wouldn't do things like make your dinner in your neighbor's kitchen, and hopefully they wouldn't do that to you either. And so among animals, sorry, that's a really simplified idea of what a neighborhood is. There are lots of territorial animals out there. And I don't mean territorial in a bad way, but just that animals have their own little slice of the world that they tend to not let other individuals onto. Yeah.
Yeah, I had never really thought about myself as being territorial, but when you think about your neighbors coming over and making dinner in your kitchen, then you kind of start to feel like maybe you are territorial.
Yeah, it's funny. It sounds like a negative word when you think about it with humans, and I've never really thought about it as a negative word with birds, for example. It's just, I'm owning this space and I'm not allowing that other individual onto it. And then there are other animals all around me that have their own little slices of the earth, and in a certain geographic space, that's my neighborhood. Yeah.
Right. So in animals and birds, how we have fences that we put up, how do birds know when they're crossing onto someone else's territory?
Yeah, so birds, as many of you know, are very acoustically oriented animals. So they sing a lot. So I'm talking specifically about songbirds here. And so we hear them a lot in the spring and the summer, singing away. And a cool thing about animals that use acoustic communication like that is that lots of individuals can hear it at the same time. So if I'm in my neighborhood, say I'm a bird, and there are lots of other birds around me, I can hear all my neighbors singing when they're all singing at the same time. I can hear a bird 2 territories away, or 2 houses away, hear him singing. And birds actually use that beautiful melody to defend their territories, which is kind of a cool concept, because for us, it's this beautiful, sweet sound of spring, whereas for a lot of birds, it's a war cry. Like, this is my territory. I'm occupying this territory, and if you step onto it, we're going to have a problem. And so how they define their territorial boundaries is that they patrol them. They fly around their territories. The species that I work with, actually, it's very cool. If you get up in the pre-dawn hours, and lots of birds do a similar thing around dawn, there's just an explosion of birdsong that happens. And it's thought that for a lot of species that this is like prime time for redefining your territory boundaries. So explosion of song, and these birds just race around the edges of their territories and give these little short bursts of song. And if there's a dispute, so if one neighbor thinks, well, actually, I think the boundary's more this way, and tries to push it, they'll start that dialogue with song. And so they will sing back and forth at one another, and if that conflict fails to be settled with their melody, then it might escalate into not song.
So it sounds like then property lines, so to speak, are pretty fluid, like they change day to day.
They can. Yeah, so it depends on the species that you're working with. So the species that I tend to work with a lot, it's a pretty defined area during the breeding season. So you'll know that X individual is over here and Y individual is over there. But depending on competitive ability, resources, there are lots of factors that can move the boundary around a little bit. The species that I work with, I'm deliberately not saying it because I want to see if you guys can guess it based on the song in a little bit. Hopefully I won't forget and show you the picture. But sometimes males will just pack up and leave their territory completely and set up somewhere else. So fluid, yes, but I mean, they're familiar with who their neighbors are. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when a male gets up and leaves outright, is that because he's found like a better neighborhood, or he was in a bad neighborhood, or he had bad neighbors?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question I'm really curious about with respect to this species in particular. So for lots of birds, they'll pack up and leave if they have a nest failure. Which is kind of sad. So if things aren't going well, they might just say, I'm out of here. If resources are bad, mm-hmm. and a better territory opens up somewhere else, then they'll take off.
Would resources just be talking about food, or would it be other things like nesting sites or other aspects of the territory?
Yeah, all of those things. So birds are pretty attuned to all sorts of, all those components that go into making a good territory. So food, some species prefer particular like perches, so they need certain kinds of perch heights that are available. If there just aren't any ladies around, males might be less inclined to stick around. I can show you guys one of my neighborhoods. I do have a couple of images to show you guys. Is this an okay time?
Yeah.
So let's see. So this this is a Christmas tree farm in Hatfield, so not too far away from here. So it's an aerial view. These are the little Christmas trees in sort of rows. Chipping sparrows love Christmas tree farms and cemeteries. These are two of my most favorite places to find. Oh, I said the species. Shoot. Okay. I'm going to play a random song, and I'm not going to tell you whether or not it's my study species. Shoot. Chipping sparrows. Okay. Anyways. What's that? Anyways. Okay. So one of the things that I do when I'm looking at different neighborhoods is I'll go out and map chipping sparrow territories. So I'll go out over several mornings in a row, early in the morning, with my recorder and an aerial map, and in this particular plot, I have banded individuals. So I have put color bands on the bird's legs. So every time I see a bird, I know that's mellow yellow, it's yellow white, and he sings a certain way. And you can follow them around and sort of delineate their different territories. And so this is, for real, these are the birds that occupy this particular space. And so the different color blobs are showing roughly the areas that I found over many, many observations where those individuals maintain their territory. During this particular breeding season, this guy actually took off at one point and was replaced by another bird. But so this is sort of a snapshot in time of these individuals. I'll talk more about what the little symbols mean, but essentially that's their song. So not only were they individually distinct by having color bands on them, but they actually sing in individually distinct ways. But we can talk about that later. That's my neighborhood. That's
Cool.
a neighborhood. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So I feel like we're kind of leading up to talking about what kinds of interactions neighbors might have. We've talked about kind of like more of the conflict side of things when people are kind of pushing in on your space.
Yes.
Are there other types of interactions as well that might take place?
Yes, yeah. I often say I study animal behavior. So depending on who asks me what I study, I might say animal behavior. And animal behavior, instead of sexual selection or bird communication, I don't know, it's different levels. But animal behavior is really all about costs and benefits. And if you think about these individual males setting up their territories, when they're negotiating those boundaries, if they're constantly fighting with their neighbors throughout an entire breeding season, it's a really costly thing to do. Like every day, wake up and do battle with your neighbor. And so there's actually this effect called the deer enemy effect in lots of territorial animals, where if individuals can recognize who their neighbors are, they sort of habituate to their presence. As long as they know that bird singing there is that bird that has that territory and he's not intruding, I'm not going to react as strongly to that bird every single time I'm hearing him on his territory and singing. So that's one, it's not really positive, I guess, it's just less negative.
So yeah, there is a spectrum of interactions that can take place.
There is, certainly, yeah. Lots of birds, it's very cool. They're very aware of the activities of their neighbors. So there's been some really fascinating work done with song sparrows, so a closely related species, showing that if one bird sort of defects, right, and intrudes on another bird's territory, the other birds in the neighborhood notice that and are a little more reluctant to trust that bird in future interactions, which is very cool. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think this is a good point to open it up for questions from the audience, if anyone has one.
Yeah. I guess I will keep it specific. But with the chipping sparrow, you were saying, how is their hearing, both frequency and sensitivity-wise, compared to like us?
Very similar to ours. Yeah, it's a great question. So there's been some great work on just that very question. A man named Dooling, who has sort of mapped out the frequencies that generate the highest response in the brain, and it maps pretty closely onto what humans can do. Yeah, and it's a great proxy because I know if I can hear the birds X distance away, I know a chipping sparrow can roughly hear the same thing. Yeah, luckily. Yeah.
How do you capture the bird to land it?
Yeah. I use a net. I wish I brought a picture of one. I could probably dig one up, but that would take too long. It would be very boring for you guys to watch me sift through my computer. But they're called mist nets. So they're very fine. We set up what would look like a wall of net. So I take 2 poles, or many rows of poles, and put this fine net in between. And the way it works is there's a very taut piece and then sort of a net of a basket in between each taut piece. And it's very hard to see. If you, in fact, don't warn a human being, for example, I've got a mist net there and they're not paying attention, they'll walk into it. Similarly, a bird will fly into it and they get a little tangled and stuck, and you can fish them out and put a band on them and release them. And there's been a lot of studies showing that this has, I'm sure they're stressed in the moment, but they go back to their territory and they, for the most part, are fine. Yeah.
Do you see these territories change over time?
Yeah, I do.
And is there reasons for that?
Yeah, it's a great
That you
question.
notice?
Yep. So I mentioned a couple ways that they change over time, right? So individuals can sort of renegotiate the boundaries depending on resources, aggression, or what have you. Or males might pack up and leave, and then a different individual will come in. It's been a big part of my dissertation work to try and parse out why these patterns shift and change over time. And so actually, the screen before, I'm going to show you a failed experiment. But these you can kind of see these little letters on here, and these actually mark where I put out microphones. And so I put out, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 microphones. So we call this a microphone array that I could put out. And I did this in a bunch of different chipping sparrow neighborhoods. And the goal here with this setup was to map over a breeding season exactly what you're asking, how those territories shifted around. How I did it with microphones was a little overly ambitious, but people have done it before. You can use the differences in time of arrival of sound to the different microphones to really precisely map every time a bird sings where they're at. And people have done it successfully. It turned out the recorders that I had kept breaking down over 3 seasons, and finally the company that made them, who had been out to my field site many times and tried themselves to get them to work, we just agreed to call it even, got my money back, and so I don't know. What I have is a snapshot of many different song neighborhoods at this point, instead of a fewer number of neighborhoods where I could watch over an entire season. So a different approach, but the same sort of question. And resources is part of it. What I'm really curious about is some of the social interactions that happen, and sort of the different quality of males that are in each of these neighborhoods. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other species that have neighborhoods in the same area?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So in this particular Christmas tree farm, there are a lot of other species that like to call it home. So indigo buntings is a very common species that we find out there. Song sparrows are pretty common. Towhees, eastern towhees are really common. And so similar to chipping sparrows, you could map out their territories in the same sort of way.
So they all just overlap?
Yeah, so they don't tend to bother each other too much. I've done some experiments. This is totally fascinating to me, but if there are any birder enthusiasts out here, we had pine warblers nearby at the edges in these pine trees. And sometimes when I was doing a playback, and I think we might get to this at some point, where I was playing the sound of a chipping sparrow to elicit a really aggressive reaction from a territory holder, sometimes pine warblers would come in, and their songs are actually sort of similar. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of a confusion on the bird's part, but for the most part, different species, unless there's like a moment of, is that really a pine warbler or a chipping sparrow? They tend to leave each other alone. Yeah.
So you mentioned that they often call during at dawn.
Yeah.
Is that just because the sound travels further, or what is
Yep.
it about dawn that they often, why do they call
Yeah.
it dawn?
That's a great question. One that has many answers. And I don't know that anyone has nailed it down exactly, because there's lots of evidence, and it could be all of these things. But you said, does sound travel better? Yes, that is one hypothesis on why they call more. And I said that they're defending their territories because they've had all night, and sometimes birds come in and territories change overnight, so they have to wake up and do their thing first thing in the morning. Some think that it is a show of it's like showmanship. Like, I didn't even eat all night, and I'm up, and now I'm racing around my territory like crazy because I'm that good. Those are the big ones, though. There are a handful of other smaller ones, but yeah, it's this very curious thing that most birds do that we're not 100% sure. Chipping sparrows. A man at UMass who graduated from our program worked with chipping sparrows about 10 years ago, did some really fascinating work, and he did this very cool experiment where he went out to a neighborhood and he removed all the birds except for one. So left this one male all alone in his neighborhood. And without any neighbors, he didn't do his dawn chorus. So some might consider that evidence that the social factor plays a big part in whether and they're singing. Yeah.
Okay, great. Maybe one more question on this section?
Yeah.
So I noticed that it looks like this particular neighborhood that you map has these sort of natural boundaries where it's mowed.
Yeah.
Do the birds sing more on the abutting edges to the other territories?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't know that I know the answer to it. My suspicion is yes. But I haven't parsed out the data singing versus just detecting the bird. My suspicion is yes, because that would be where they really needed to be singing. There's some really neat work with spiders. I think it's spiders, a territorial species of spiders, where if you give them an arena where they can easily delineate their boundaries based on available things in the landscape, they tend to be a little bit more, they set up their territories more quickly and are more calm about it because it's very clear where their territories actually are. Whereas if things are a little squishier, you might expect more song and more intense interaction at that border because it's harder to remember. Yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, great. Before we launch into the next section, I'm just going to start this form going around. It's just to get on our mailing list if you're not on it already. You can fill in your name and your email address. We can just send it around. There's a pen on the clipboard. Okay, so for our next section, we're going to talk about birdsong in more detail. And we've been kind of getting little bits and pieces. So I guess the first question I'm going to ask is, what are all the different things that birds would use their songs for?
Yeah. The first is, I guess, I would say there's a bit of a distinction in the songbird world between song and other vocalizations. So song is what we typically hear on a spring morning, a chickadee or a chipping sparrow singing away. There are other vocalizations that birds do, so they might call or make just short little vocalizations. But you asked about song in particular, and we've been talking about some interactions between males, and that birds use song to defend their territory. So I described that. So that's one big function of song. There's another one. Does anyone know what the other one is?
Creating a mate.
Yes, yeah. So these are the two big things. So defending your territory and attracting mates. And those are the two biggest. Yeah.
Great. So you're kind of already talking about the difference between song and other types of noises that we might hear.
Yes.
So as a scientist who studies birdsong, what are some of the different things about a song in particular that you might be interested in? Like, what is a song to you?
What is a song?
Yeah.
Well, I work with a species that sings a trilled song. So I showed you some spectrograms before. This is a chipping sparrow song, and this is a spectrogram. So this is a visual representation of sound. So we have frequency on the y-axis and time on the x. I can play this for you. So you get a sense it's a note that's repeated over and over and over again. Sounds a little insecty. I'm going to play it for you. Again, because it got cut off. So that's a chipping sparrow song. How to start this question? So, because birds use their song to defend their territories and attract mates, one might wonder if there was something in song that gave you some indication about that particular individual. So is there something in the song that suggests that a male might be a better territory holder, more aggressive, a better rival? Is there something in song that might suggest I'm a better mate, I'm going to take care of the babies better? And for lots of species, which is very cool, this is actually the case, that there's a lot of information contained in song. So we're really unpacking song here. It's not just a sweet sound that you hear in the spring. It's a war cry. It's a tool to attract mates, and there's a lot of information that can be contained within it. So trilled songs in particular are just especially awesome because it's a really challenging vocal feat. It's really hard to go tweet, 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 tweet over and over again. And males and females pay attention to this. Some of the things that they pay attention to is how quickly males can sing these tweet, 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 tweets. And males that do a better job of tweet, 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 tweeting really fast for their given vocalization structure tend to be better rivals, and they tend to be evaluated more favorably by females. So I knew that going into my work with chipping sparrows, that was true for a lot of birds. I didn't know that for chipping sparrows in particular. But it was a good starting point for my work. Yeah.
So is it always just the males who sing, and males and females listen?
For chipping sparrows, yes. For song. Yeah, so it's the males that sing, and that's true for a lot of birds in temperate zones, that the males tend to be the one that sings, and both males and females are paying attention to. If any of you guys were at Luke Ramachili's talk, he talked about bird song and the brain and where song is stored. I'm not super familiar with a lot of like the neurophysiology work, but both males and females store memories of song when they're learning song in their brain. And so males are learning not only to store it in their brain, but to produce it. Females learn songs too to create a template in their brain to evaluate, is one hypothesis. But if you put electrodes in the brains of males and females and play them a song that they had heard before, both males and females will react. Both their little action potentials would go off. So there's some representation in the brain for both males and females. In tropics, and I don't know a lot about this, so don't ask me, males and females often sing. Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it.
Yeah,
We'll
okay.
leave it there. Very interesting. I might just ask one more question before we get to the audience. So this is a visual representation of a song, and we heard the song that goes with it.
Yes.
So if you had a song from a different species, it would look different on the screen, and it would also sound different to us. We would be able to tell them apart.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, I brought some different songs. Actually, first just to go in order, I'll show you, this is my study species, for those of you that aren't familiar with chipping sparrows. I didn't take this picture. Okay, but you asked about different species. I didn't put their spectrograms on.
Oh, okay. Well, you can just take your word for it that
Yeah.
they would be different.
Okay. I'll play you guys a closely related species. I'll play you two closely. Here's my substitution for giving away what bird I work with. So I'll play you guys two different sparrows that aren't chipping sparrows, and see if you can guess what they are. So I'll start with an easier one. Are there any birders in the audience, or anyone that wants to? Okay. All right. Good. Here's the first. Song sparrow. Yes. Okay. I'll put their pictures up in a second. And then here's a challenging one that's not a chipping sparrow. No. Good guess. Not a field sparrow. I think the microphone moved away, which changed the amplitude, because otherwise I might have guessed. This is a swamp sparrow. Sorry, I had a couple other birds. So this guy right here, I put him up here because my lab mate, who has moved on, worked with swamp sparrow. So another trilling sparrow species. Yeah. I guess one other thing I can quickly show you guys is that, were you going to ask me about this?
Well, you can just go right for it.
Okay. So I guess to look at spectrograms a little bit more closely, So I mentioned that chipping sparrows sing individually distinct songs. And so I thought it was neat to show you guys a visual representation of that and hear some sounds. Because it's pretty neat that our ears and other animals' ears can categorize a different species and say that's a chipping sparrow. But at the same time, they can look so different among individuals. So each of these 4 spectrograms represents a different male from that same study site that I showed you. And they sing these songs for their entire lives. So this is a chipping sparrow. And this is a chipping sparrow. And so is this guy. This guy sings really fast. And then mellow yellow isn't playing. You get the gist. Those are the 3 of them. Okay. That was all I wanted to show you with the different spectrograms.
Yeah, that's really neat. Let's open it up to the audience now.
Is that the same message, do you think?
The same message?
Yes.
Well, depends on the level of the question. So if the question is that a chipping sparrow or not, then yes, it's all the same message.
Right.
If it's a female prospecting, those might be very different messages. If it's a male who is intruding on another bird's territory, that might be different too. So I think it's all about the receiver who is listening in on the song and what the motivation actually is. I think what you're asking is, are these all equal quality males? Yeah, it's a good question. No, probably not. And so we're going to talk about this, I think, in the last part, but a little bit about how birds use these different measures of quality. And so I'll maybe give you a hint of it, in that chipping sparrows are really attentive to the speed of the song, so how quickly these subsequent notes are produced, and they react very differently depending on how fast that trill is, sending a different message.
So you can't use this to identify an individual bird?
You can, actually.
You can, okay.
Yeah.
And then what about the concept of a dialogue, a regional?
A dialect?
Yeah. Dialect, I should say.
Yep, yeah. So, first question, I can use these to identify the individual. Individuals are very consistent with how quickly they sing and the structure of their song. And so, this visual representation is useful to show you guys what sound looks like, but it's also very useful for me to be able to extract some numbers out of it. And it's very consistent, the numbers that I would extract for these birds. And then the second question was dialect. Yes, so lots of birds have accents. And so the song sparrows, right, if you listen to a song sparrow here, it's going to sound pretty different than a song sparrow, say, in Florida. It will have a southern accent, which is totally cool. And you can hear the difference. And that's true for lots of different species that have wide geographic ranges, that they have accents depending on where they're from. Chipping sparrows are unusual in so many ways, but in one way that they're unusual, they have this really broad geographic range. They're found across most of North America, but they don't have dialects. So they have 22 or 23 different song types that are repeated across the entire range, but there aren't, at least there isn't any evidence yet that there are any pockets of dialect. So you could find the same song type repeated here as you would, say, somewhere in the middle part of the US or the northern part of Canada.
So these 3 that we heard aren't different dialects?
No.
Different individuals?
Yeah, it's confusing. Yeah, so these are different individuals. A different dialect would be that in this region, maybe all the birds sing with a slightly lower average frequency. That might be something that's a dialect. Whereas a song type, we refer to like this structure would repeat somewhere else. Yeah.
So would bird A sing bird C song at some point? Or not necessarily?
Yeah, so not in chipping sparrows. They're stuck with the same song type, so this structure, for their entire lives. There are other birds out there that can sing different song types.
So it's not considered a different dialect?
No, it's not. Yep, yeah. Yeah, it's...
That's confusing me.
Yeah, no, I wish I could do a better job. I'll try again. It's more like a regional specialty. So if you only heard this song type in Boston, right? That would be Boston's regional specialty, and you could consider that a dialect, right? If you heard it nowhere else. But the thing is, you can hear this Boston accent all across the U.S., so therefore it's not really a Boston accent, it's just a song type. Yeah. Yeah.
In trying to communicate with a particular bird, like at your house,
Yeah.
I suppose it can be both attractive or territorial. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a good idea to try like a catbird.
Uh-huh.
It might be interested that I'm calling to it, but it might also think that, oh, well, I guess it's her territory.
Yeah. You mean like playing a catbird song?
No, I mean like me talking to the cat, like a cat. Imitating a catbird.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so a catbird would probably not be amused by that. So we do this very thing in the fields. We play back songs. And so if your catbird that lives in your yard, if you played or sang a catbird song back at him, he would perceive, if you were good enough at singing a catbird song, which is like extra challenging because it's a catbird, he would perceive that as an intruder on his territory, and he'd be pretty angry. I'm going to show you guys a video of what birds do when you do things like that. So the attractant part is more for the females, right? So if you were really good and sang a nice catbird song and there was a lady catbird around, who knows?
Because I can get them to like call back to me.
Really? That's great. We have catbirds in our azalea bush too. I'm very excited for them to come back. I haven't tried singing at mine. Yeah. Catbirds are cool too because they are mimics. So they keep learning their songs throughout their lives, and they do a lot of improv. So maybe your catbird is trying to incorporate some of your catbirdiness. Yeah.
At what age do they lock in on the song, and is there a period during which they develop this song?
What age do they develop their song?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty early on. So these guys hatch throughout the summer, and then they start practicing. So they'll do like sub-whisper song throughout the summer. They will migrate in the winter, and then they will come back, right? So their first year back on their territories, and they will crystallize. So they might have a couple of different song types that they've been practicing, but that first year back, they'll crystallize their song, and it will be matched to a near neighbor. So again, this is some really awesome work that was done by the former student in our program. So Wan Xuan Liu did some awesome work really laying out the learning period of chipping sparrows and exactly the length of time that it takes for them to crystallize their song. So he did that by both bringing birds into the lab and following birds around in the fields. Just an extraordinary amount of work. Yeah.
One more question.
So with the crystallizing, you said they come back with a couple songs. Do you have any idea like why they might choose song A versus song B? Is there any hints at that?
Yeah, that's
a really complicated question.
No, it's a great question. I don't know that we know. So the thing with them crystallizing their song and matching it to a neighbor, it's not clear if they are picking their neighbor based on what they have in their brain already, or if what they have in their brain, it's hard to tell which comes first, right? The song in their brain or the neighbor that they're picking. And it's another step back is, what they have in their brain. Is there any sort of like filtering process? Like I'm, so good at learning song. Maybe I can learn like the best, fastest chipping sparrow songs that are out there. Or maybe I had some sort of stress going on during development, and I can only learn these kinds of songs, and that's going to limit me. I don't know much, and I don't know that anyone does.
So with the picking of neighbors, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Is that more sort of assessing how good is that bird, can I beat him type assessment, or is that the type of comparison when you're saying he's picking his neighbors, or is it
Yeah.
more?
Again, I don't know. My suspicion is, so just anecdotally in the field, I've seen neighbors who have, young birds right next door that have the same song type. Well, how should I put this? It seems like they're pretty tolerant of their neighbors. And in general, I've seen a little bit of evidence that the older birds get, I said that they're pretty consistent with how quickly they sing, but over time it actually upticks. Like if you follow a bird for 4 or 5 years, they get a little bit faster as time goes on the order of milliseconds. But it's noticeable and discernible to other birds. We know that they can detect that kind of variation. And I have a feeling that young birds are tolerated next to birds that sing the same song type if they sing it more slowly. That's my suspicion. But I'm hand waving. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's move into our last section. So here's where we talk about more communication and signaling and assessing our neighbors and eavesdropping and all this kind of stuff. So you recently published a study with chipping sparrows. Suggesting that they use information in song to decide whether or not to help out their neighbors.
They do.
Could you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah. This was very surprising. Sort of a story about serendipity in research. So one of the studies that I was doing with chipping sparrows pretty early on in my PhD was asking how males responded to that variation and how quickly songs were produced. Let me show you with that. Let's see if I can skip over this. So, for example, I would take a speaker out into the field, and I would take a song, and I would slow it down, and that same song, I would speed it up. And then over 2 days, I would play that song back to a territorial chipping sparrow. My advisor took this picture. I think it's very cool. This is what I'll show you a video too in a little bit, set in the cemetery, of what chipping sparrows do. So they come in pretty close, they try to figure out who this bird is, where he is, they wave their wings around, and you can actually quantify their response to these behaviors, to the playback. So you can put out flagging, and you can measure how close they come into a speaker, how much time they spend in different distances, how often they sing. I had a taxidermic mount of a chipping sparrow too, so you could count how many times they attacked this fake chipping sparrow that I put out. And so my prediction here was that if birds are paying attention to this variation in timing, that they would respond more aggressively to the faster song. And I did find that, which was great. That's great. But it wasn't that unexpected, because we know from lots of other trilling birds that this happens, that males are very attentive to this kind of variation, and they will react more aggressively to these faster trilled versions of song. And I said it's because it might indicate a better quality bird. Just to elaborate on that a little bit, it's a really hard thing for a bird to do, a bird in particular, because every time they sing another note, they have to rearrange everything. So they have to open and close their beak really quickly. They have to rearrange the musculature and coordinate that with the syrinx. It's just a really challenging thing to do really quickly. And so birds that are in better condition tend to have learned faster versions of these songs when they're younger, which is cool. And again, like I said, they can uptick it a little bit over time as well. Okay, so I was running this experiment, and I gave you a bit of the punchline here in that I found that territorial males respond more aggressively to these faster trills. But then this other thing started happening, and that was that occasionally, when I was doing these playbacks, a neighbor would come in. And this is unusual. Well, it's not super unusual. Sometimes like a neighboring bird will come in to check out what's going on, like who is this intruder. What was fascinating though was that it was happening pretty regularly, so maybe 1 in every 5 playbacks I was doing. And he wasn't just hanging out. he was actually doing the same things that the resident was doing in response to the playback. So he was wing waving, he was chipping, he was coming in close to the speaker. He was acting like he too was trying to eject the intruder. And the first couple times this happens, I was really frustrated as a second year PhD student running my first big experiment. And every time a neighbor came in, it would wreck the experiment that I was running because I was trying to measure the behavior of that bird. And when another bird comes in, it really messes up how you measure that bird's behavior because now he's got another bird to interact with. And I thought, oh gosh, maybe I'm messing up. I'm measuring these birds' territories. What am I doing wrong? This is really frustrating. But I just kept running the experiment. And then it occurred to me this was happening regularly enough that it probably wasn't just me, that I was measuring their territories pretty accurately, and maybe something else was going on. So I'll show you guys a video of, oops, sorry, I forgot I had a microphone on. I broke it. Okay, so I apologize for the setting. So what I'm going to show you here, and I think you might have to take my word for it that there are two birds in this video. But basically, what you'll see, this is the speaker here, and you'll see a bird flying around doing the kinds of things that chipping sparrows do when you simulate an intruder. So he gets very angry. They do these wing waves, chips a lot. Oh, no, I showed you the other bird. Never mind. That's the resident. This guy on the gravestone right there, that's actually the neighbor that came into the territory. I had a really hard time getting both birds in the same shot there. So this was really surprising. I had recently read some work in fiddler-crabs describing a similar behavior. I mean, a completely unrelated organism. But in a number of fiddler crab species, sometimes a neighbor will come in, and these guys fiddler crabs are territorial too, which is kind of neat. Sometimes I read a neighbor will come in and help eject an intruder, but only under really specific circumstances. And I thought, this really looks like this chipping sparrow is trying to eject this intruder off of this territory. That's pretty weird. And it turns out I found an older paper in rock pipits, which is a European species, suggesting a pretty similar behavior, but that was the only other record that I found among birds of what they called coalition forming. Sounds very fancy. But essentially, so these neighbors are temporarily forming an alliance to try and eject this intruder. Sounds pretty far-fetched. And I thought, okay, well, if it's happening 1 in every 5 times, is there any pattern to when they might be doing this? And so I looked at their trill rate, and I wondered if you guys had any thoughts, because I wasn't sure going in. Does anyone want to guess what the pattern was? Yeah.
If I'm satisfied with the neighbor,
yep,
and this artificial neighbor is much stronger than the guy I'm putting up with now, I'll help him get rid of him because I can control my neighbor.
Exactly. That's exactly what I found. Yeah, so what you're saying is, okay, there are these two birds that are neighbors, right? And suddenly there's a new intruder who's singing really quickly, right? As a neighbor, I have 2 options. I can step back and let that big scary bird come in and take over, probably. Or I can help get rid of that big scary neighbor and keep my crappy neighbor. And that's exactly what it was. Yeah, so I didn't have a ton of data from that first season. I had 9 times I observed this occurring. The first pattern that I saw was every single time we saw a coalition form, the neighbor had a faster trill rate than the resident, right? So he was always better. His neighbor next door, always the crappier bird. If we can call it crappy based on trill rate. So again, this is all about trill rate. So he was singing slow, I was singing fast. And then 8 of the 9 times that a coalition formed, the bird that came in was faster than the resident, right? So the bird that's coming in has to be faster than the bird that he's trying to eject. Yeah, fascinating. So they're very attuned to not just their own song, it's not just females assessing, males as prospective mates. It's not just this dyadic interaction. It's the neighborhood. It's a neighbor next door paying attention to what's going on nearby and potentially intervening. And I've explained this a couple of times, and I'm super glad you guessed it on the first try. Because people, when I say that these birds help each other out, or they form these coalitions, people leap to an altruistic sort of explanation. That is not what's going on here, right? So, I don't have any precise measurements of costs, but if 9 out of 9 times this is the kind of pattern that we're observing, it's in the neighbor's benefit to get rid of that bird that's coming in. He's a challenge to his own territorial boundaries and potentially to females that are coming in. Like, you're the new big guy in my neighborhood. We don't want that. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one question, maybe 2 if they're quick.
Yeah.
Sarah, I come often and I'm always interested, especially in how those of you in this department are doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, if I'd be curious, when did you start studying birds? What drew you to it? What do you hope to do?
Sure.
Because we take a lot of these things for granted.
Yeah.
And it's always nice that someone is studying them, but I'm curious as to your story in a short version.
Sure. Yeah, I got into birds during my undergrad. I went to Colby up in Maine, to a small school. And then I worked on a number of bird projects. I think I got hooked on birds when I was doing my undergrad. I had a great ornithology instructor. I love birds. I'm not the greatest birder. I think birds are beautiful and they make a great study subject, and you can ask some really cool questions with them. I love working with birds. I feel like I should say I don't limit myself taxonomically. Like, I've been working on this cricket project for in the future because I'm really interested in acoustic communication, and I have my own hobbyist interest in birds and love them, but that doesn't have to be birds. In terms of the future, probably industry. Working with birds in the bird manufacturing plant. There's and this is not a very practical career choice. I don't know. I love what I'm doing right now, and I'm very open to whatever the future holds. I love communicating science, or trying to communicate science, and I'm a huge proponent of basic research, no matter what the outcome is. So I don't think things have to be studied just because it's going to help us with our economy. I think just understanding the natural world is intrinsically useful, and so that's the path that I'm taking. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time, unfortunately. Sarah will be here for a few minutes.
Sure.
Afterwards, if anyone has any questions. So thank you all very much for coming. Our next event is on March 3rd. The title is Déjà Vu. Repeated Forms in Evolution with Dr. Daniel Moen. So we hope you can join us then. Same place, same day of the week, so Tuesdays now at ABC. Thanks to ABC for hosting us. Okay, have a good night.